Good afternoon. My name is Gideon Pogrund. I direct the Ethics and Governance think tank at GIBS, and I'm pleased to be hosting this session with Professor Mollie Painter, who heads up the Responsible and Sustainable Business Lab at Nottingham Business School. GIBS and Nottingham Business School are working on a critically important project whose aim is to understand how we can support whistleblowers and enable speak out cultures. The focus of this project is on South Africa, but we believe that the South African experience offers insights and lessons with a much wider relevance. And so we're glad that a number of people from outside South Africa have joined the webinar. Mollie and I are delighted to have the opportunity to interview Brian Currin. Brian has a long and illustrious career. Under apartheid, he was a prominent human rights lawyer and activist. He headed up an organization called Lawyers for Human Rights, which played an influential role in the struggle against apartheid. And he played a no less significant role in the immediate post-apartheid era. He was an instrumental figure in the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Brian then spent a number of years working in various conflict areas around the world, where he drew on the mediation skills that he'd applied in South Africa to promote peace and reconciliation. He was heavily involved in Northern Ireland, where he worked for around 9 years and contributed to the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. Brian eventually returned to South Africa, but not to put his feet up. He became very much involved in the struggle against state capture. And for those of you not familiar with how that term has been used in South Africa, it was a term popularized by Thuli Madonsela, the former state public protector, to refer to the wholesale takeover of public institutions by associates of former President Zuma, often facilitated by shameless international firms. Brian was instrumental in the Gupta leaks, the sourcing and leaking of thousands of emails from the Gupta empire. The Guptas were a family who were working closely with the president at the time. Brian arranged for 2 whistleblowers working for the Guptas to share their emails and for them to be safely relocated out of South Africa. And then he arranged for the release of those emails to the media. South Africa is indebted to a number of moral heroes like Brian, who helped save our country from state capture. And it's a wonderful privilege for us to have the opportunity to speak with him about his experiences and to have him reflect on his insights and learnings. So thank you very much, Brian. Let me kick off with a first question. Brian, looking back on the work that you've done in various contexts, in South Africa under apartheid, in various places of conflict like Northern Ireland, and then again in South Africa in the post-apartheid era, what has made you act in the way that you did? What has been the common thread in all of these experiences, and what also has been different about them?
Thank you, Gideon. Before I answer the question, I just would like to correct one thing that you said. The whistleblowers never worked for the Guptas. It was, in many respects, a coincidence that they managed to get the hard drive. So they never worked for the Guptas. To answer your question, Gideon, I think one just I need to go back and just point out that I qualified as an attorney in 1977. I was doing articles in Pretoria, which was really the capital city of that evil system of apartheid. I did my articles in 95 and 96, and I qualified in 97. And it just so happened, and there were many circumstances that gave rise to that, that I very quickly found myself involved in political work and became very much very quickly enmeshed in human rights work as an attorney before I was, before I set up Lawyers for Human Rights, the National Directorate, to the extent that, newly qualified, enmeshed in that work, it almost became part of my DNA. It's part of me. It just became part of what I am. And clearly human rights and any struggle or fight for human rights is all about justice. And I suppose from a child, I've had a strong sense of justice. I'm not sure how that is. I suppose many people do, but this fed into it. So I think in terms of what I've done, whether it was in South Africa or whether it was in Northern Ireland, the Basque Country, and other countries where I've worked, or back in South Africa in the last 5 or 6 years working here full time, it's always been informed by that which is, goes to my very core. And that's a strong sense of justice and a DNA that is founded in human rights. So that was, I think, covers the first aspect of your question. The other one, it was really, you did touch on that, didn't you? You spoke about my role in the 3 different periods. And just to touch on that, they're all very different. However, there is a common thread. They're different in the sense that when I worked as a human rights activist and lawyer in South Africa, essentially I took sides. We know who was perpetrating the human rights violations. We know where the injustices came from. We know of the oppression. We know that apartheid was a crime against humanity. So it wasn't difficult to take sides as a human rights lawyer, human rights activist. And that was really what I did. Once apartheid had gone, and after the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I moved on, and I was requested to go and do some work in Northern Ireland. Interestingly enough, that work in Northern Ireland came from a connection between the ANC and Sinn Féin IRA. And so when I went to Northern Ireland, essentially I went and was seen as somebody who had links with the ANC, and the ANC was linked to the Republican movement. And it was in Northern Ireland that I personally experienced the transition from being a human rights activist on one side to a person who could play a role as a go-between, as a facilitator, as a peace process facilitator. And that happened not in a way that I'd planned or even thought of in advance, but essentially because after I started working with the IRA volunteers who had been released from prison and Sinn Féin, I was approached by the loyalist paramilitaries and their political organizations to work with them as well in the context of setting up a process that would result in the release of political prisoners. So my work in Northern Ireland was therefore basically a mediator, a facilitator, a go-between, and in that context, and I suppose it'll become relevant, it is relevant, a huge sense of the necessity to build trust with parties, with both parties, with all parties. After Northern Ireland, and at the same time I was working in the Basque Country, and again in the Basque Country when I initially went in, not through design, but just because of the fact that in Spain there was this perception that I had worked in Northern Ireland with the Republicans. Somehow there was an oversight that I'd worked for other parties as well. I was perceived as someone that was on one side. As it happens, most of the peace processes that I've gone into, I've been invited to participate or be in the peace process by the non-statutory group called by some terrorists, called by others liberation forces. But it so happens that my entree to peace processes has generally come from that side, and I've had to work my way into the process and develop a position where I could be trusted by both or all sides. Back in South Africa, once again, and just to go back, obviously that work in those jurisdictions where I was working in the context of civil wars, again, what drove me was a sense for justice, a knowledge that that type of environment, context of civil war, as we know, we just need to look around the world today, results in massive human rights violations. So sort of retreaded as a human rights activist lawyer, somebody looking at how one can resolve the conflict in order to take out of the equation human rights violations. When I decided to then focus again in South Africa about 5 or 6 years ago, the question that I was asking myself, and this is before the Gupta leaks, the question I was asking myself is, why is it that in a country like South Africa and many others, where there has been a huge conflict, where there has been a civil war, where there has been a peace process, a new democratic dispensation, one is still faced with a situation where there are gross human rights violations? Looking at South Africa, as we know, and has become more and more apparent as we go along, the disparity between the rich and the poor is huge. We know about economic and social injustice in South Africa. And so I began to ask myself the question, why is that? The answer might seem obvious, but I think it was important for me to interrogate that and to understand it. So what I'm doing now in that context through an organization called Concentric Alliance, we really focus on strategies that can help to be a catalyst and build trust and relationships between the public sector and the private sector, because our analysis is, and one looks at it, that toxic relationship that exists, which is very much a legacy of apartheid, that toxic relationship which exists between the private sector and multinationals who are perceived very often still as imperialist forces coming in to extract and take away, and the governments, because not only South Africa, that toxic relationship undermines economic growth, undermines the potential which these countries in South Africa has, which we know about. And in the course of doing that, setting up this organization, this company, and doing that work, obviously during that period as well, post 2000, 2003, 4, 5, we became increasingly aware of the corruption, state capture, and so on, which feeds into that situation which we have in South Africa, which is now being aggravated by that. So, so once again, this third sort of iteration of what I do, I'm looking at human rights violations and how to address those, but the focus is on socioeconomic rights.
Okay, thank you. Mollie.
Thank you, Brian, for that. We're going to take questions as we go along while Gideon and I are asking some questions to you. Please feel free, if you're joining us, to use the Q&A button to send some questions. But next question to you, Brian, is what is the role that moral courage plays? How does it actually work in practice? Is it this kind of extraordinary act, once off, or is it more of a kind of a habit that you have to cultivate over time? Getting to that golden mean that Aristotle talks about between cowardice and foolhardiness? Or is it something of a deliberate judgment that you look at a set of systemic factors and you decide?
Yeah, look, I mean, that's a difficult question to answer. in many respects, because one doesn't like to be seen to be preaching about moral courage. But I believe that it's something, and I'm not sure whether one should be starting at the beginning or at the end of your questions, but I think it really goes to one's essence, one's core. When one sort of is confronted, as one is daily confronted with challenges and difficult decisions, not all of those challenges and difficult decisions go to one's sort of deep inner sense of what is right and what is wrong, but some of them do. And for me, I would say that moral courage is a line which you draw as to, in that context of what is right and what is wrong, which is not negotiable, because it goes so fundamentally against what you believe deeply as to what is right and what is wrong. And just to make the point that obviously we all disagree on fundamentally, when I say we all, if I think about the planet Earth, when I think about all our different cultures, our different religions, our different ideologies, we all disagree on what is fundamentally and what is right and fundamentally wrong. One can say there is a universality of right and wrong, but to an extent, yes, but to an extent, not. And so something which for me might be morally unacceptable, maybe for somebody else acceptable. I've worked with different organizations that have waged wars, and I've worked closely with people within those organizations, and they've done things in the name of justice, in the name of what they believe was morally right, which I could not agree with. But that doesn't mean to say that they were morally wrong. If they had that deep sense of injustice and the reason why they were waging that particular war. So it doesn't always, and to go to the next sort of aspect of your question, something that it doesn't always have to be in the context of an extraordinary event. I think on a daily basis, many of us find ourselves in positions where we need to take a stand. And I just think of a very sort of simple example where you might be at a dinner party with friends, and there's talk about where South Africa is, and you find the narrative goes into that space where everyone starts talking about the good old days. And what do? Do you just listen to that? Or do you respond to it? And I find myself incapable of not responding to that. And I always find myself then having to kick back and to express a counter view, which is not always a popular one, and sometimes has resulted in, I suppose, the end of what was a pleasant dinner party. So, I mean, that essentially, I think, goes to something deep within one, where you believe that certain things are just not negotiable. And that probably answers the question about whether it's a habit or not. Because if I sort of think back on my life and my career, I think the first time or the second time one needed to take a difficult decision and take a stand, it was far more difficult to do then than what it is now. Probably for many reasons, because you know, in many respects, I don't want to say I've lived my life. I still hopefully have another couple of decades to go. But the bottom line is, you know, I've done a lot of the things that I wanted to do, and I have maybe just say I've lived a life, and it's easier for me today to take a strong stand than what it was previously, but also in the context of it's almost it's instinctive now. It's a habit. Something is said, something is done, and immediately you just feel you need to respond to it.
It's a good point to perhaps pick up on relationships, because you've mentioned quite a few relationships in what you've just explained. What is the role of trust? From what we've heard about your relationship with the whistleblowers who came to you and all of the other people involved, it seems that relationships are so fragile and trust is so easily broken. How do you deal with those trust issues? Can trust be repaired, for instance?
Yeah, trust is a very difficult concept, and I've grappled with that for a long time. We use the word in so many different contexts. For example, we spoke about, and one speaks about, well, there was sufficient trust between Mandela and de Klerk to be able to sit down and negotiate a future and a new constitutional dispensation for South Africa. But is trust not something which is absolute? Can you trust somebody 50%, or is trust trust? And is it absolute? So that's really a philosophical discussion that one could have for a long time. But trust is something that is absolutely critical and has been critical in the work that I have done, particularly when I started working as a peace process facilitator with different parties. Because the trust relationship doesn't begin, in my work, with building trust between the parties who are the antagonists, but it begins with you as the facilitator, as the mediator, building trust with those parties. And that can take a long time, because only if they trust you will you be able to have a significant impact on their thinking. So for me, in that context, trust has always been critical. That relationship is a relationship over which has a level of control, because you are a party in that trust relationship. When it comes to building trust between others who are engaging with one another, it is more difficult because you don't have control in any way over that relationship. You can, and I do, one tries to school and skill people in what needs to be done in order to build trust. But humans, and we are all like that, we have emotional lives, we respond often instinctively and badly to situations. And something which I learned particularly in Northern Ireland is you can spend months building trust between two parties, but because the history and the conflict is so deep-seated, because there are so many fundamental differences in the way they see life, almost from Venus and from Mars, a single word, which is innocently spoken, can have a serious impact as an insult and can undermine the work that you've done over, as I say, months. So building trust is a very, very difficult challenge, but it's something that you have to do in that context of relationship building in order to have a successful negotiation. When I think of the Middle East, I spent between 1991 and 1999 going to the Middle East quite regularly for an organization called the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. I mean, most of the work I did was in Gaza. In those years, in those days, I was working with Palestinian lawyers and lawyers from Israel. And they worked constructively with one another and progress was made. Today, there is no trust. And parties attempt to negotiate, but it's not really it's not a negotiation, and it can't be, because parties simply do not trust one another. They have not gotten to even know one another at a very fundamental level. And for me, that is an essential equation. And we do that now in South Africa, and the work we're doing in the private sector, particularly between mining companies and mining communities. And one in that context needs to be able to build trust with all the stakeholders. Without that, you can't do the work. It's simply not possible. I'm not sure if I've answered all your questions.
Great, thank you. Maybe we could take one of the questions that has been sent through on the chat. A question from Helen Taylor about going back to the discussion around moral courage and the role of social media. Are young people able to find and voice their moral courage more easily due to social media? I'm thinking about internationally and with regard to freedom of speech and also the climate emergency. That's from Helen. Would you like to respond to that, Brian?
Well, I think the answer to that must be yes. The problem with, I suppose, with social media is that there's lack of accountability. One can sort of virtually say anything and almost be unidentified. I can remember the days when I started writing letters to newspapers. You had to give your name, your ID number, and your address, and they wouldn't publish your letter and your opinion unless you did that. Whereas today with social media, and I would say very often, unfortunately, the abuse of social media, one can be very, very courageous, but there's no accountability. And I think it's easy to be courageous if you're not held to account. So it's a qualified.
Sorry.
I'm saying it's a qualified yes.
Right. Question going back to whistleblowers or whistleblowing. As part of this project, we interviewed around 25 people who had been whistleblowers or who had supported whistleblowers. And what many of them spoke about was their experience of character assassination, how they had been victimized or turned into pariahs. Question that we were curious about was your view about this. Does it just have to do with framing? In other words, the difference between seeing a whistleblower as a moral hero or as some kind of pariah or outcast? Or are there actually, in your experience, more substantial differences? It's been suggested that there are three types of whistleblower. There are people who whistleblow purely out of moral courage, people who act selflessly. On the other extreme, you have people who are entirely self-interested, who are about to get into trouble themselves and end up betraying former comrades to save their own skins. And then you have a third type, sort of in the middle, a kind of hybrid, someone who to some extent acts on the basis of moral courage, but who has also in some way been implicated in moral failure. What's your sense of that? Do whistleblowers tend to fit into a more kind of morally ambiguous category? Or is it a question of just how we frame and view it?
I don't think it's only a question of how it's framed. There are many questions there, and hopefully I answer all of them. But it's not only the way we frame it. It can't be, because essentially we know that there are whistleblowers that come forward in good faith and do the right thing out of moral courage. We know that. But what we also know is, depending on who controls the narrative, those people who have the moral courage and who are whistleblowers for the good reasons can be portrayed as pariahs, as you say. But that doesn't mean that they don't fall into the category of doing it for the right reason. Sometimes, and I suppose it's because it depends on who is controlling the narrative, one might believe that a person is a sellout or a pariah or had an ulterior motive because it was narrated that way. You know, a person that comes to my mind in the context of narrative is Robert McBride. You might remember that, you know, Robert McBride, during the apartheid era, who was on death row for a very, very heinous crime that was committed, was regarded by the ANC and the liberation movements as a hero. Within the apartheid state, he was a villain. People hated him. White South Africans hated him. Obviously, black South Africans didn't. Subsequently, more recent times, where he has become, through an institution, a whistleblower, certainly during the Zuma time, he was branded as a pariah, and all attempts were made to discredit him. But the DA, on the other hand, who represents, to some extent, that previous constituency, would come to his defense and talk about his integrity in the role that he was playing. So the same person can be portrayed and presented in so many different ways by the same people, just depending on where that person sits in this sort of political space at the time. And I think whistleblowers can fall into that category as well. So, and I mean, naturally one does get whistleblowers, as you've suggested, who might do it for the wrong reason, in order to save their own skin. They may have been part of something which was abhorrent, and there is accountability which is awaiting, and they would then blow the whistle. And in that context, what comes to one's mind immediately are certain individuals that were part of the Vlakplaas group within the South African security forces, who came forward during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, knowing that there was a strong possibility that they could be prosecuted. And some of them came forward and testified as whistleblowers in that context for the wrong reason. However, and I've worked with a number of those people subsequently, and one in particular who was a senior person in the military that came to me, interestingly, as a human rights lawyer, and we sort of conceded right the very first time we met that we were arch enemies on the other side. But he asked me to assist him and to represent him at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because he wanted to come out and reveal, partly also because he could see a post-South Africa, and he wanted to be out there and to play a role in post-South Africa. Now, his reasons were questionable, but the bottom line is what he did was right. and what he said helped other processes and fed into a broader picture of what the TRC set out to achieve. But the other part for me, which was quite interesting, was that during that period, inevitably, I built a relationship with him. And he changed during that process of working with him over a period of 2 years. So at the end of it, having gone through the process, the way in which he saw South Africa and post-apartheid South Africa was very different from the way that he saw it even in post-apartheid South Africa when he started that process. So it doesn't, one shouldn't write off people who maybe do it for the wrong reason. One needs to work with those people if you have the opportunity, because good can come out of that. I think that you asked a question about, and you suggested my relationship with the whistleblowers.
Yes, we tried to understand the role that the trust relationship had to play, and then if relationships can't be sustained because of other power dynamics and other factors, how you deal with those very tricky, complex relationships. And perhaps while we're at it, we can perhaps throw in a question that came through the Q&A on investigative journalism, because also there the trust relationship is so crucial. And the person was asking about the motivation of a journalist for revealing these kinds of stories. Is it just the person's job, or is it a sense of moral courage again? And maybe the trust relationship is another question to think about in terms of the role of the profession, the journalism profession.
Yeah, I'm not a journalist, so it's difficult to speak from that perspective. But certainly the journalists that I worked closely with during the Gupta leak period were people who had a deep sense of integrity and who, as good journalists, wanted to get to the bottom of the story. And they were committed to revealing the truth, irrespective of the consequences. And that's the bravery and that's the moral courage of journalists. As professional people, as journalists, what they also are doing clearly, they are building their own reputations within their own professions. It's what we all also do at the same time as the content of the work that we do. We're also building our profession and our own reputations, which are critical for the work that we do. So clearly, I think a journalist is doing it, A, because that's what journalists do. And if it's a journalist of integrity and with moral courage, they will do whatever they need to do in order to present the story. But they also at the same time building their brand and their reputation. And one can't take away from that. That's completely essential. And it's also about building their own integrity for the next story that they break and the next piece of work that they do. So I think it's critical that they do actually build their reputation and their integrity. But going back to the trust and the relationship with whistleblowers, and I think you were speaking particularly about my relationship with the whistleblowers in the Gupta leak story. Clearly, and by the way, I didn't do that work as a lawyer, as a professional. I did it because I believed it needed to be done. So it wasn't a paid job. It was working side by side with these whistleblowers to try and assist them in delivering the objective that they had and an objective that I shared. To be able to do that, never having met the whistleblowers, it was critical that one actually built a relationship of trust with them. Because just as much as I needed to trust them that what they were giving to me and which was going to journalists was authentic. At the same time, one also had to ensure that they trusted me and that I would not let them down, and I would protect their integrity and protect their safety and security, and also deliver to them that which I had promised, amongst which was the opportunity, enough funds to be able to leave the country because of the risk and to live abroad for a period of up to 2 years. So we needed to trust one another. And we did achieve a level of trust. And again, I talk about a level of trust in the context, knowing full well that, going back to that philosophical discussion, that there's either trust or there's not. We trusted one another in the context of the compact which we had to deliver, and what I needed to do and what he needed to do. Unfortunately, and there are many reasons for that, and I don't want to blame the one person in particular, because his situation was a very difficult situation. And it is always difficult for whistleblowers. We need to acknowledge that. I found it increasingly difficult to work with him. And I often found that in order to achieve the ultimate objective, I had to choose between doing what he said I should do and doing what I believed I needed to do in order to achieve that objective. There were always discussions around what needed to be done. But on one particular occasion, the expectation was such that, from my perspective, the project would have been undermined completely. And I took the decision that I would not do that. And I said so, whatever that might be. And that then began to really, I think, fracture the relationship. And I mean, that's something which is very difficult, and it saddens me that that is the case. But I think that one has decisions to take on occasions, and they might be hard decisions. But that was the decision that I took.
Thank you for that, and thanks to Sue Swat for that question about journalism. I hope you got your answer. What we would like to know now, Brian, is the future. What does the future look like post-Gupta? Carrie Linnell has asked a question on the Q&A. She says that state capture has now created such anger and distrust. How can we move forward?
Well, that is absolutely true. I think that what the Zuma years delivered to South Africa was a failing state. We're not a failed state, but we certainly have been, and possibly even now continue to be, albeit at a slower pace, a failing state. What I think many of us are hoping is that the line has been drawn. There is a credible commission of inquiry that is investigating state capture. Much evidence has already been gathered, which is supported by the 300,000 emails that are out there that have been analyzed and that are being worked on as we speak. And I think what we should expect, and maybe what's happening at the moment, where we all locked in our homes, and where we are being told every day and are experiencing that this is going to be, post-COVID, a very different world. And maybe all of this is going to sort of play into the changes that prior to COVID were clearly, in my view, inevitable, where there would have to be a drawing of the line, where there would have to be accountability for the wrongs, where there would have to be prosecutions at the highest level, where there would have to be the formation of a legitimate state. Certainly up until 18 months ago, South Africa as a state had lost its legitimacy. I mean, the legitimacy comes from the power that politicians are given through a franchise system. But it means far more than that to maintain that legitimacy. And if we just think about the total lack of service delivery and the problems we face in the health sector and the education sector, people have lost their trust in the state. We have to rebuild that trust in the state. To do that is going to have to be a collective effort by all the stakeholders, business, private sector, multilaterals, ordinary South Africans, civil society, politicians who have to come clean, public servants who need to do their jobs. All of us have to put a shoulder to the wheel and together build a new and better South Africa. People have said to me before that we won't be able to do that until we hit rock bottom. And I'm just wondering whether we're not sort of heading now, brought fast forwarded by the COVID virus, the situation we have now, whether that has not been fast forwarded and the building of a new South Africa having to be expedited. I mean, just very briefly, we started doing a little bit of work in the health sector. And that's looking at what work needs to be done to facilitate dialogue between the public health sector and the private health sector around this NHI. Well, that was 3 or 4 months ago. What's happening today now has forced those two sectors to begin to look and to work together, and probably brought that forward by a few years if they had not been forced to do so by this current crisis. So I think this current crisis, as awful as it is and as dire as the consequences are going to be, and we all have to work towards lessening and mitigating that, is, in my view, going to assist broadly the country and force the country to work together sooner than what we would have had it not been the case.
Thank you. Great. Mollie, now we're almost out of time. Would you like to close?
Yes. One final question, and perhaps just a short answer to that. Do you have advice for whistleblowers? Do you have an idea of what you absolutely should not do if you come across unethical behavior, and something that perhaps you should do? How do we enhance a speak out culture? As you know, this is part of a broader collaboration between Nottingham Business School and GIBS on speak out cultures. How can we help whistleblowers?
Well, I think the best way of helping whistleblowers is to create a safe space for whistleblowers. But whistleblowers do not always have a safe space. You can have strong institutions like we have in South Africa, and there is a witness protection program. The problem is people do not have confidence in the warm bodies that head those structures necessarily. And if that is the case, then you have not created, or the country has not created, a safe space for whistleblowers. So I think when one looks at an institution like a witness protection program, there should be mechanisms in place to ensure that people that head those and staff those are people of absolute integrity, and that we all know will indeed look after your safety and your security. So for me, that is absolutely essential. And the private sector, if that is not the case, and if that does not exist, then the private sector should come to the party, come to town, and enable and set up a structure which can play some role in enabling and assisting whistleblowers. Whistleblowers, Yeah, I suppose I could
Thank
go on
you,
along.
Brian.
but,
The admin staff are telling us that we're nearly out of time, and I do want to take this opportunity to thank you for your wonderful inputs in the interview we had with you and in this specific conversation. And thank you to all of you who joined the chat. We heard that there's more than 200 people online, so thank you so much. And please don't forget to join the GIBS chat tomorrow at 2. To look at all the other wonderful work GIBS is doing. And we wish you a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.